In this lecture, we begin a more detailed analysis of Articles 8 through 22, or really 9 through 22, excluding 16, which concern the obligations concerning high-risk systems. Now, for the exam, I think if you are able to memorize both of those mnemonics and you know the obligations at a high level, that is sufficient. In this and the next 3 lectures, I'm going to be providing a little bit more detail on each of these obligations. I cannot guarantee that you are only going to be tested on knowing the item itself. I imagine there are going to be some questions on these details. So here we are going to discuss Articles 9 and 10. 9 concerns risk management and 10 concerns data and data governance. A sneaky section of the exam is likely to cover the GDPR and sensitive data and its intersection with the EU AI Act. So pay attention to those slides. And we will conclude with bias testing. So concerning risk management, the greatest risks as far as the EU AI Act are concerned concern product safety and fundamental rights. Providers must identify foreseeable risks, implement controls to mitigate risks, and test controls to ensure efficacy. Risk management, as we've already discussed, is a continuous iterative process. This includes identifying emerging risks discovered during post-market monitoring, and this continuous monitoring will be assisted by deployers. So providers and deployers must remain in constant communication in order to assess and mitigate these post-deployment risks. For modified, quote-unquote, white-labeled systems, the modifying organization should become the provider. And so we talked about this very briefly before. If a deployer makes a substantial modification to a system, the deployer may now become the provider. In this circumstance, the original provider should cooperate with the new provider to make sure they have everything they need to assume the provider responsibilities. This includes providing deployers with training to mitigate and monitor risk. In addition to these requirements, AI operators must also consider whether the system may have an adverse impact on children under the age of 18 or other vulnerable groups. Article 10 concerns data and data governance. These obligations apply to AI model training, for example, training a neural network, and includes the training, validation, and testing datasets. Data governance practices include tracking data provenance and curation, the original purpose of the data collection, the data preparation process, for example, annotating, labeling, and cleaning data, identifying and mitigating data gaps, shortcomings, and negative impacts. And this would include checking for representativeness, bias, incompleteness, inaccuracies, outdatedness, lack of diversity, and quality. To the greatest extent possible, datasets must be relevant, representative, complete, and error-free, and must account for the functional setting and intended use of the system. Now, concerning Article 10, which again is on data and data governance, there's an intersection here with Article 9 of the GDPR. We've already discussed the GDPR and special categories of data or sensitive data. Examples include racial and ethnic data, political opinions, religious and philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic and biometric data, health data, and data on an individual's sexuality and sexual orientation. You'll remember that there's a general prohibition on collecting and processing this data unless there's a specific exception. And those exceptions include explicit consent for employment, vital interest, legitimate activities of nonprofit bodies, if the data is made publicly available by the data subject, for public health, archiving, research, and statistical purposes. The exceptions I have here are worded slightly differently than you saw in the earlier lecture. Remember the 6+3 mnemonic from earlier. That's going to be an easier way for you to remember and memorize this for the exam. Now, we also discussed in that earlier lecture that one of the exceptions for collecting and processing this data was to permit bias testing or bias detection. Under these circumstances, there are additional obligations on the AI operator. They include implementing strict access controls, making sure that the data is not processed by other parties, and that the sensitive data is deleted once the bias testing, detection, and correction is completed. In this lecture, we went over Articles 9 and 10 of the EU AI Act. These concern risk management and data governance. Regarding risk management, the provider must identify foreseeable risks, implement controls to mitigate risks, and test controls to ensure efficacy. Similarly, the provider and deployer must communicate with one another to identify, assess, and mitigate risks. Concerning data and data governance, it's important that the AI operators track data provenance and curation, the original purpose of data collection, data preparation processes, identify and mitigate data gaps, shortcomings, and negative impacts. To the greatest extent possible, datasets must be relevant, representative, complete, and error-free, and account for the functional setting and intended use of the system. Finally, remember the notes here concerning the intersection of AI and the GDPR. In short, AI operators may collect and process sensitive data for bias testing.